BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays this year, I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to the bonus Zodiac Killer episode that I did on John Parr Cox as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, but I also did a Thursday episode, a special Thursday episode on the Zodiac Killer suspect, John Parr Cox. And this is going to be a big week for bonus episodes. In addition to the regularly scheduled lineup, I will also be doing a bonus episode on the Long Island serial killer mystery. And that is one where a suspect has been apprehended. His name is Rex Heuermann, and he is currently in prison. And there have been some new developments in the case which I will be responding to over the weekend. And next week, I'm hoping that there will be an additional bonus episode where I talk about the book The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout. I have another channel on YouTube called AstroPsych 400 where I talk about psychology and just human behavior and thinking and things of that nature. So I did one episode over there where I was talking about the book The Sociopath Next Door that really wanted to focus on the more interpersonal side of the book, relationships, dealing with unfriendly coworkers and stuff. But I also wanted to do a bonus episode, a book discussion that focused on the true crime aspects of it. So please look out for a future book discussion on The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout here on this channel. And if you're curious about these unsolved mysteries and criminal psychology, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And also feel free to tune in every Monday for a segment about the Zodiac Killer, every Wednesday for a segment about Jack the Ripper, and of course Cooper Fridays here on BBOR. In this episode, I will be discussing the D.B. Cooper suspect, Robert Rackstraw. And on Fridays, I've been going through the D.B. Cooper suspects, starting with the suspect profiles. I'm mostly a newcomer to the case, so I wanted to try and analyze the suspects first. Some people think that it's not the most practical avenue to go down when you're exploring an unsolved mystery, but there is a little bit of curiosity killed the cat, and there's also the opportunity to actually evaluate these people with a fresh set of eyes. Does this person seem like the individual that could have pulled off the D.B. Cooper skyjacking? And I would actually like to go straight to dbcooper.com to provide the most basic introduction to the D.B. Cooper story. In November of 1971, a nondescript man bought a $20 ticket for a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle, later demanding $200,000 ransom and a parachute in what would become one of the most infamous cold cases of all time. Identifying himself as Dan D.B. Cooper, really he identified himself as Dan Cooper, he would later vanish without a trace, skydiving from the rear of the plane, with the cash in hand, prompting decades of debate and conspiracy over the brazen thief's true identity. And he used the name Dan Cooper, and the name D.B. Cooper was mistakenly given to him by some media sources. That's the nutshell version. But in this episode, I'm going to be talking about Robert Rackstraw as a D.B. Cooper suspect. Now, the loudest voice to bring him forward and to discuss his likelihood of being D.B. Cooper is, of course, Thomas Colbert, who is the co-author of the book The Last Master Outlaw. And Tom Colbert gets a lot of different titles in the different articles. Sometimes he's referred to as a writer, sometimes he's referred to as a broadcast journalist, sometimes he's referred to as a documentarian, sometimes he's referred to as an investigator, sometimes he's referred to as the leader of a team of investigators called the Case Breakers. And to be very honest, I learned about Robert Rackstraw and Tom Colbert and this whole aspect of the D.B. Cooper mystery because of the Zodiac Killer case. When when the Case Breakers went public with their suspect in the Zodiac Killer mystery, Gary Francis Post, Tom Colbert was also at the helm of that. But the book out on Robert Rackstraw being D.B. Cooper is called The Last Master Outlaw. And I have some initial forms of skepticism going into this because in the Zodiac world, I just personally believed that Tom Colbert was completely wrong about everything that he said involving Gary Post as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and that is a different mystery, but it caused me to have some doubts. And to be fair, Gary Francis Post was the suspect of an individual named Chris Avery, who then contacted a man named Dale Julin, who was working as a broadcast journalist, who was a broadcast journalist, and Dale Julin went on to write the book about Gary Post as the Zodiac called Catching Zodiac, and I have an interview with Dale Julin here on this channel where he gives his side of the story. But then Tom Colbert took this narrative, he took this research that had been done by Dale Julin, and then he put the case breaker spin on everything. So I think that he did a very poor job in that particular one, and he presented a lot of evidence that was very flimsy. So when I was looking at his D.B. Cooper suspect, I had a lot of doubts, and I really was coming into this maybe with not exactly a closed mind, but I was not holding my breath, if you can understand me. And I also want to be clear about one thing. When I was looking at Robert Rackstraw at first, I was thinking, this guy doesn't exactly sound like D.B. Cooper to me. Instead, he sounds more like Frank Abagnale and the movie Catch Me If You Can, the one they made with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, where it appears that Robert Rackstraw was indeed a real con man. He was perhaps indeed the last master outlaw. Maybe he was D.B. Cooper, maybe he wasn't, but the things that he was actually involved with in his own criminal life do match up to that definition. And to help us out, we're going to go over to an article on ATI, All That's Interesting. This is written by Kalina Friga and John Kurowski, just citing the source. According to a cold case investigators team, the Army pilot and Vietnam War veteran Robert Rackstraw perpetrated the D.B. Cooper plane hijacking on November 24th of 1971. In 1971, a businessman hijacked a plane from Portland to Seattle, demanding $200,000 and a parachute. After a successful air heist, a man commonly known by the pseudonym D.B. Cooper jumped from the plane, disappearing somewhere in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. And I know that this is just an article from ATI, but I was just thinking about that when I read it the first time. I was like, now wait a second. How on earth do you know that D.B. Cooper was a businessman? Firstly, this article is about Robert Rackstraw, who wasn't even really a businessman at all. I mean, that's how Tom Colbert portrays him. He's the last master outlaw, a con man. And then, yes, Robert Rackstraw is going to do other things in his life, like going on to become a college instructor, actually, and to also graduate with an economics degree and so on. Okay, that does sound a little bit businessman-like. But the point is, how on earth can anybody say that D.B. Cooper was a businessman? He was wearing a suit and tie, but that doesn't make him a businessman. He was dressed like a businessman, but countless people have brought that up in the comment section. He could have bought those clothes from a thrift store, some type of secondhand store. He could have taken them from somebody else. He could have stolen them from somebody's closet when they didn't know. He could have been wearing his brother's suit or something like that. Countless explanations have been created and generated about how D.B. Cooper planned the skyjacking heist. So to say that he was a businessman, I know that might sound a little bit minuscule, but I just wanted to draw attention to that. So back to ATI. The crime which has captivated Americans for decades remains unsolved to this day. However, some cold case investigators believe that D.B. Cooper was a man named Robert Rackstraw, a former U.S. Army paratrooper. Though Robert Rackstraw never admitted to being the hijacker, he often met questions about his alleged involvement with a wink and a smile. To this day, even after his death in 2019, many still consider him the prime suspect in the case. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say that he's regarded as the prime suspect in the case. Robert Rackstraw is definitely widely discussed as a D.B. Cooper suspect, but I don't know if he's called the prime suspect in the case. And I also want to point something out. Robert Rackstraw is widely discussed because the case breakers and Tom Colbert are actually pretty good at popularizing a suspect, and that's the long and short of it. Now again, Robert Rackstraw is not just some Joe Schmo. Like Gary Francis Post, that Zodiac killer suspect I was talking about, that guy was a house painter from California. I mean, he didn't ask to be inserted into the Zodiac killer mystery. Robert Rackstraw was indeed a real-life criminal, and he was also somebody who is, what you just heard, was listed as an Army paratrooper. In other sources, I believe it's on his own Wikipedia page, though, he's listed as an Army pilot, former Army pilot, and the point is he's a Vietnam veteran with dozens of medals. That's what I read, dozens of medals that are connected to aviation. So he's somebody who would have had a very strong understanding of planes and flying, things that the captain would be doing. And this is one of the things that I'm saying in almost all of these Cooper Friday episodes when I'm like, I don't think that D.B. Cooper was somebody who just read up on airplanes a little bit and read up on skydiving a little bit, because there are suspects out there who don't really have a paratrooping background. So this seems like somebody who would have had the brain to have been D.B. Cooper, criminal, con man, army, pilot and paratrooper. Those things are not exactly prerequisites. I just think that more likely than not, no matter whom D.B. Cooper was, he might have had those components, those items on his resume. But let's get some info on Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1943. Rackstraw led a life that reads like an action novel. After dropping out of high school, he became a U.S. Army paratrooper, an explosives expert in the Vietnam War. Although his tour in 1970 earned him dozens of air medals, Robert Rackstraw was kicked out of the military the following year. Alongside other misconduct, he lied about finishing high school. It was a pattern of behavior that would continue across the ensuing decades. One friend said that Rackstraw had charisma to burn and a criminal mind. A deputy district attorney who prosecuted Rackstraw for fraud and theft called him a hell of a con man. You'd buy a used car from him every time. But despite his nefarious behavior, Rackstraw seemed to consistently escape the grasp of the law. At one point, he was even charged with and ultimately acquitted of murdering his stepfather. I was acquitted of everything as I recall, Robert Rackstraw told the Washington Post. However, soon after the acquittal, Rackstraw's clean spill came to an end. In 1978, he was charged and convicted of stealing a plane and forging checks. He then roughly spent 2 years in prison. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. However, I do want to go through this thing step by step. Robert Rackstraw was born in 1943, and as I've already said about 3 or 4 times, the D.B. Cooper skyjacking took place in 1971. Robert Rackstraw was only 28 years old at the time, and the estimates that people put forward for D.B. Cooper is around age 44. I mean, we're talking like 16 years older than Robert Rackstraw. And when you read the websites that are talking about how Robert Rackstraw could be D.B. Cooper, they say things to the effect of, all right, the actual witness descriptions are 35 to 45, so he's only 7 years younger than the actual witness descriptions, and that's a lot of age to miss. To look at someone who's 28 years old and think that they're 45, it's definitely possible, but I definitely think that that's on the improbable side. And even those same places that are talking about Robert Rackstraw being D.B. Cooper, saying this guy was most likely D.B. Cooper, they even admit that the biggest pieces of criticism relate to his age, only being 28 years old at the time of the skyjacking. Yeah, okay, he had the background that seems like what D.B. Cooper might have had, because it's not only just that he was ex-Army, ex-Vietnam, and he was very familiar with planes. I was talking about the quotes from Mike Davis on a previous episode of Cooper Friday when he said that it is very rare for civilians to go skydiving at night, parajumping at night. That is something that is mostly done by the military. Paratroopers jump at night in the military, and D.B. Cooper would have been jumping into the dark, into cloud cover, and these things seem like someone who was ex-military and knew what he was doing, because there are suspects out there who don't really have that strong skydiving background, so it's a very tough time to explain something like that. But as far as being a liar, a cheat, and a con man, you hear the stuff, charisma to burn and a criminal mind. The kind of guy who would, the con man that will sell you a used car every single time. Yeah, that sounds like what D.B. Cooper would be doing, because the way that D.B. Cooper is acting on the plane is he's reported to have been acting like a gentleman, and I think that I was a little bit harsh on that introductory paragraph when it says that D.B. Cooper was a businessman. It seems like he acted like he was a businessman. He's being very formal, but con man means confidence man, and this seems like the type of guy that would have created and composed a charade like that and been able to pull it off. So, I mean, though we have to give credit where credit is due. But let's go back to this other thing here at the end, that he's convicted of stealing a plane and forging checks in 1978. I believe it's on his own Wikipedia page where it states that he's actually busted in Iran, in pre-revolutionary Iran before 1979. But what they stated was he was arrested for check fraud and the possession of explosives. Those were the charges. And then ultimately he was deported back to the United States. As I said, he is the last master outlaw. But I don't know well, should you even really call him a master outlaw if he got busted so many times, kicked out of the military, deported out of Iran, and as you heard from this article here, spent 2 days in prison because I talked about the movie Catch Me If You Can at the beginning, and that features Leonardo DiCaprio playing Frank Abagnale, a con man, a guy who's very good at check fraud and coming up with these elaborate schemes. And somebody once asked, do movies like that glorify the con artist and the criminal? Do they show a positive light on the criminal? And somebody once gave me a very good answer to that particular question, saying no, because I hate to ruin the ending of that movie, but I mean, Frank Abagnale was caught and captured. Robert Rackstraw was also caught and captured. The last master outlaw, maybe not a master outlaw, but definitely someone who is doing things that do come out of an action movie, so it seems. Back to ATI. The D.B. Cooper hijacking remains one of the strangest aviation mysteries in American history. On November 24th of 1971, the well-dressed man boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. Shortly after takeoff, he told a flight attendant that he had a bomb. Originally calling himself Dan Cooper, the media later mistakenly called him D.B. Cooper. He said, "I want $200,000 by 5 p.m., he told a flight attendant, in cash. Put it in a knapsack. I want 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. When we land, I want a fuel truck ready to refuel. No funny stuff or I'll do the job." See, how could anybody say that D.B. Cooper did not have an intense familiarity with planes? I know it seems like common sense to refuel the plane, but if just the way that it's structured, it just seems so matter of fact, and it seems like he's going straight down a list purely from memory and experience. It seems like D.B. Cooper had a very intense familiarity with aviation, and he wasn't somebody who just decided to plan this, who had no real career with aircrafts. But that's just my take on the subject. And you can respond to that if you want in the comment section down below. If you think there are any clues that would indicate that D.B. Cooper was not familiar with aviation. Notice that I didn't say skydiving. Oh no. I mean, I think that he was very familiar with planes and how they functioned. He knew that the aft staircase wouldn't have a cockpit override. He requested that the plane fly at 10,000 feet. But just hearing that language and how well structured it is, that seems like a guy who knew a lot about the steps of the planes. And that doesn't immediately mean that it was someone who was a Vietnam veteran paratrooper, because there are all types of people who have exposure to aircrafts, like, say, for example, Kenny Christensen, another D.B. Cooper suspect. He was a flight attendant for Northwest Orient. Milton Vordahl was a scientist and metallurgical engineer who worked with aviation. So there are going to be different types of career pathways that people would have before they would get pulled into something like this, and before they get pulled into being a D.B. Cooper suspect, that is. But I would actually like to go over to an article from the San Diego Union Tribune, and it talks about the death of Robert Rackstraw. San Diegan featured in a program about notorious D.B. Cooper skyjacking dies in Bankers Hill home, and this was written by Jeff McDonald in 2019. Robert Rackstraw was the subject of a 2016 miniseries examining the unsolved D.B. Cooper skyjacking from 1971. He was a high school dropout and U.S. Army paratrooper trained in explosives and psychological operations. He worked as a pilot for hire in pre-revolution Iran and served more than a year in prison for stealing a plane and passing bad checks. Robert Rackstraw, who died early Tuesday in Bankers Hill in a condominium, was also a suspect by amateur sleuths who investigated D.B. Cooper, the legendary skyjacker who jumped from a Northwest Orient Airlines jet somewhere over southwestern Washington in 1971 with $200 in cash and into history. D.B. Cooper was never found. It was not even clear if the hijacker survived the leap from the back of the plane on Thanksgiving Eve nearly 50 years ago. Okay, more than 50 years ago now. As I said, this is right after the passing of Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw, whose army photo bore a resemblance to the notorious mastermind. I'm going to throw in one interjection there. I hate to throw in this interjection mid-sentence, but can I be very honest with you? I don't think Robert Rackstraw resembles the D.B. Cooper sketches. And I also think that the D.B. Cooper sketches look like someone who was much closer to age 45 than age 28. But I'm just not seeing the facial similarities among any of the sketches and Robert Rackstraw. I'm just not seeing it. And if you want to dispute that, you can put your thoughts in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. Maybe your comment will be worked into a future episode of Cooper Friday. And, as I said, you can hit the like button and subscribe, but you can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88, and that allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. If you want to support all of the efforts that go into making these episodes here on Black Box Online Radio, please consider making a donation. But back to this concept of the age. I mean, when you're talking about someone's physical appearance, I've dealt with a lot of this in my life. Like, I'm 36 now. And when I was 15 or 16, everybody thought that I was 18 or 19. They thought that I looked a lot older. But by the time I actually turned 18 and 19, everybody thought that I was 18 and 19, and they thought that I was age appropriate. And I think a lot of it deals with how people gain and lose weight, and people associate certain weight classes, for lack of a better term, with age, so to speak. And when I was 23, I lost a lot of weight because I gave up drinking soda for 6 months. Instead of going from 4 or 5 cans of Coca-Cola a day, I went straight to 0, and I lost around, 20 pounds. And not purely from that, because of some other things like exercise, but I lost 20 pounds, and then everybody thought I was older. Everybody thought that I was in my late 30s, and I was 23 years old, and then 24 years old, they thought that I was in my late 30s as well. And then by the time that I turned 34 or 35, everybody thought that I looked younger because I definitely am bigger and heavier than I was when I was 23. So then the youngest anyone thought was 19. I still don't believe that happened when I was 34 years old. I don't think I could ever reasonably pass for 19, but that's what somebody asked me. They might have been a little bit messed up in the head, but the whole point is you can't tell. I mean, you can't always tell somebody's age immediately by looking them. You must have had this experience. Like, I went to a bar once, and I was introduced to somebody's friend. I would have thought that the guy was 40, but then he told me he was 31, and I was just quite shocked because I was 31 at the time, and I was like, I just couldn't believe that we were the same age. And I thought that he would have definitely been about 10 years older than me. These types of things happen. But I'm just going to call it as I see it and say, I don't think Robert Rackstraw truly matches the composite sketches. So, back to the article from the San Diego Union Tribune. In the film by Thomas Colbert, Rackstraw is confronted, and he is offered $20,000 for the rights to his story of the 1971 hijacking. Rackstraw appeared interested in the money, but resisted confirming the filmmaker's theory, because he could have faced criminal charges. Now, is that really evidence? If you offered me $20,000 to say that I was D.B. Cooper, I'd consider it. I mean, I probably would have to say no because it's so implausible, but I mean, I don't know, you offer $20,000 to do anything, people might consider it. I don't know if that's evidence. And Robert Rackstraw ultimately said, I told everybody that I was the hijacker before explaining the admission of the stunt. He asked twice to see the check that Thomas Colbert had written out before adding the non-denial assertion. The problem is, I don't remember a lot of it. Rackstraw did not respond to the interview requests from the San Diego Union Tribune when the newspaper wrote about the History Channel miniseries 3 weeks ago. The FBI considered Robert Rackstraw a suspect for a brief time in the years after the hijacking. Investigators eventually ruled him out, largely on witness testimony that placed the age of the suspect between 35 and 45 years of age. Rackstraw was 28 on the night of the crime. It's not only me that has these doubts, as you see. Thomas Colbert's investigation, which included dozens of retired FBI agents and other private detectives, turned up a number of clues that pointed to Robert Rackstraw as the possible hijacker, including the Army portrait, his paratrooping skills, and explosives training. It was in November of 1971 when D.B. Cooper showed a stewardess that he had something which he claimed was a bomb and demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Whether or not he was the infamous skyjacker, Rackstraw led a colorful life. Rackstraw completed a 15-month tour in Vietnam in 1970 with 50 decorations, including dozens of air medals. He was drummed out of the military the following year after one too many incidents of misconduct. He also worked as a private scuba instructor and later piloted airplanes across Iranian skies before being apprehended by U.S. authorities, who were sure that Robert Rackstraw was behind the theft a couple years earlier of a stash of dynamite. He was charged with the murder of a Calaveras man named Philip Rackstraw, his mother's third husband, and was acquitted. Rackstraw attempted to fake his own death by crashing a rented plane into Monterey Bay, but investigators found him months later living in Fullerton, California. He was charged with stealing a plane and passing bad checks, and later called news stations claiming to be D.B. Cooper. The story was picked up around the country before he was acquitted. After his release from Folsom Prison in 1980, he opened multiple businesses. At one point, he was appointed the chief inspector for the Riverside County Building Department, and later he won an election to be part of his homeowners association board. He also parlayed his lawman's understanding of contract law and mediation into an online teaching position at the University of California, Riverside. In 1991, he earned an economics degree from San Francisco. That's the University of San Francisco, 2 decades after getting kicked out of the Army for faking his college transcripts. Robert Rackstraw was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1943. After he passed away, he was survived by his third wife, Dorothy, and several children and grandchildren. So that is more or less the story of Robert Rackstraw. And as I said, there are just so many true crime events that are connected to his life, so many things that really you just want to know more about. And maybe he's not the last master outlaw, but definitely one of the last outlaws indeed. And I mean, I completely agree with that statement from the beginning. His life sounds like it's right out of a movie. It sounds like something that they would make into an action movie. But the issue with Robert Rackstraw is, was he actually D.B. Cooper? Of course, insufficient evidence, but you could say that about any of the suspects. What I think Robert Rackstraw is also missing is just that this type of denial that he is putting forward. For example, it's my understanding that when he says that thing, I don't remember much of it, I don't recall a lot about it, he's talking about the confessions that he made to being D.B. Cooper when he called him to a TV station as a prank. And, I mean, you can take that for what you will, but I just think he doesn't match the physical descriptions. I think that he was too young to be D.B. Cooper. And it's also some things that I encountered from having conversations with people after Tom Colbert and the Case Breakers brought Gary Post forward, was that Robert Rackstraw was very upset about their portrayal of him as D.B. Cooper. At one point even said that it ruined his life. And on Drew Beeson's channel, he did an interview with someone who claimed to have been Robert Rackstraw's drug dealer and said that the Case Breakers said they would pay him to plant evidence on Robert Rackstraw. And while that isn't the hardest piece of evidence, I'm just sharing something that I heard. And Drew Beeson is the author of Paratrooper of Fortune. He has his own D.B. Cooper suspect, Ted B. Braden, which I have a standalone episode about. But the point is, it doesn't seem like Tom Colbert is the most trustworthy individual, and it also seems like he is somebody who slants things in favor of popularity as opposed to facts. But what do you think about Robert Rackstraw as a D.B. Cooper suspect? I think there are some strong points and some weak points, and that's my ultimate final response. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I'll see you over there. Until next time.